admiration, which arises on the appearance of such objects, is one of the most lively pleasures, which human nature is capable of enjoying. Now as this admiration increases, or diminishes by the increase or diminution of the objects, we may conclude, according to our foregoing 7 principles, that it is a compound effect, proceeding from the conjunction of the several effects, which arise from each part of the cause. Every part, then, of extension, and every unit of number has a separate emotion attending it, and though that emotion be not always agreeable, yet by its conjunction with others, and by its agitating the spirits to a just pitch, it contributes to the production of admiration, which is always agreeable. If this be allowed with respect to extension and number, we can make no difficulty with respect to virtue and vice, wit and folly, riches and poverty, happiness and misery, and other objects of that kind, which are always attended with an evident emotion. 7 Book 1, Part 3, Sect 15. The second principle I shall take notice of is that of our adherence to general rules, which has such a mighty influence on the actions and understanding, and is able to impose on the very senses. When an object is found by experience to be always accompanied with another whenever the first object appears, though changed in very material circumstances, we naturally fly to the conception of the second, and form an idea of it, in as lively and strong a manner, as if we had inferred its existence by the justest and most authentic conclusion of our understanding. Nothing can undeceive us, not even our senses, which, instead of correcting this false judgment, are often perverted by it, and seem to authorize its errors. The conclusion I draw from these 2 principles, joined to the influence of comparison above mentioned, is very short and decisive. Every object is attended with some emotion proportioned to it, a great object with a great emotion, a small object with a small emotion. A great object, therefore, succeeding a small one makes a great emotion succeed a small one. Now a great emotion succeeding a small one becomes still greater, and rises beyond its ordinary proportion. But as there is a certain degree of an emotion, which commonly attends every magnitude of an object, when the emotion increases, we naturally imagine that the object has likewise increased. The effect conveys our view to its usual cause, a certain degree of emotion to a certain magnitude of the object. Nor do we consider that comparison may change the emotion without changing anything in the object. Those who are acquainted with the metaphysical part of optics and know how we transfer the judgments and conclusions of the understanding to the senses, will easily conceive this whole operation. But leaving this new discovery of an impression that secretly attends every idea, we must at least allow of that principle from whence the discovery arose, that objects appear greater or less by a comparison with others. We have so many instances of this, that it is impossible we can dispute its veracity, and it is from this principle I derive the passions of malice and envy. It is evident we must receive a greater or less satisfaction or uneasiness from reflecting on our own condition and circumstances, in proportion as they appear more or less fortunate or unhappy, in proportion to the degrees of riches, and power, and merit, and reputation, which we think ourselves possessed of. Now as we seldom judge of objects from their intrinsic value, but form our notions of them from a comparison with other objects, it follows that according as we observe a greater or less share of happiness or misery in others, we must make an estimate of our own, and feel a consequent pain or pleasure. The misery of another gives us a more lively idea of our happiness, and his happiness of our misery. The former, therefore, produces delight and the latter uneasiness. Here then is a kind of pity reversed, or contrary sensations arising, in the beholder, from those which are felt by the person whom he considers. In general we may observe, that in all kinds of comparison an object makes us always receive from another, to which it is compared, a sensation contrary to what arises from itself in its direct and immediate survey. A small object makes a great one appear still greater. A great object makes a little one appear less. Deformity of itself produces uneasiness but makes us receive new pleasure by its contrast with a beautiful object, whose beauty is augmented by it, as on the other hand, beauty, which of itself produces pleasure, makes us receive a new pain by the contrast with anything ugly, whose deformity it augments. The case, therefore, must be the same with happiness and misery. The direct survey of another's pleasure naturally gives us pleasure, and therefore produces pain when compared with our own. His pain, considered in itself, is painful to us, but augments the idea of our own happiness, and gives us pleasure. Nor will it appear strange that we may feel a reversed sensation from the happiness and misery of others, since we find the same comparison may give us a kind of malice against ourselves, and make us rejoice for our pains, and grieve for our pleasures. Thus the prospect of past pain is agreeable when we are satisfied with our present condition, as on the other hand our past pleasures give us uneasiness when we enjoy nothing at present equal to them. The comparison being the same as when we reflect on the sentiments of others, must be attended with the same effects. Nay, a person may extend this malice against himself, even to his present fortune, and carry it so far as designedly to seek affliction, and increase his pains and sorrows. This may happen upon two occasions. First, upon the distress and misfortune of a friend, or person dear to him. Secondly, upon the feeling any remorses for a crime, of which he has been guilty. It is from the principle of comparison that both these irregular appetites for evil arise. A person who indulges himself in any pleasure, while his friend lies under affliction, feels the reflected uneasiness from his friend more sensibly by a comparison with the original pleasure, which he himself enjoys. This contrast, indeed, ought also to enliven the present pleasure. But as grief is here supposed to be the predominant passion, every addition falls to that side, and is swallowed up in it, without operating in the least upon the contrary affection. It is the same case those penances, which men inflict on themselves for their past sins and failings. When a criminal reflects on the punishment he deserves, the idea of it is magnified by a comparison with his present ease and satisfaction, which forces him, in a manner, to seek uneasiness, in order to avoid so disagreeable a contrast. This reasoning will account for the origin of envy as well as of malice. The only difference betwixt these passions lies in this, that envy is excited by some present enjoyment of another, which by comparison diminishes our idea of our own, whereas malice is the unprovoked desire of producing evil to another, in order to reap a pleasure from the comparison. The enjoyment, which is the object of envy, is commonly superior to our own, a superiority naturally seems to overshade us, and presents a disagreeable comparison. But even in the case of an inferiority, we still desire a greater distance, in order to augment still more the idea of ourself. When this distance diminishes, the comparison is less to our advantage and consequently gives us less pleasure, and is even disagreeable. Hence arises that species of envy, which men feel when they perceive their inferiors approaching or overtaking them in the pursuits of glory or happiness. In this envy we may see the effects of comparison twice repeated. A man who compares himself to his inferior receives a pleasure from the comparison, and when the inferiority decreases by the elevation of the inferior, what should only have been a decrease of pleasure becomes a real pain by a new comparison with its preceding condition. It is worthy of observation concerning that envy, which arises from a superiority in others, that it is not the great disproportion betwixt ourself and another, which produces it, but on the contrary, our proximity. A common soldier bears no such envy to his general as to his sergeant or corporal, nor does an eminent writer meet with so great jealousy in common hackney scribblers, as in authors, that more nearly approach him. It may, indeed, be thought, that the greater the disproportion is, the greater must be the uneasiness from the comparison. But we may consider on the other hand, that the great disproportion cuts off the relation, and either keeps us from comparing ourselves with what is remote from us, or diminishes the effects of the comparison. Resemblance and proximity always produce a relation of ideas, and where you destroy these ties, however other accidents may bring two ideas together, as they have no bond or connecting quality to join them in the imagination, it is impossible they can remain long united, or have any considerable influence on each other. I have observed in considering the nature of ambition, that the great feel a double pleasure in authority from the comparison of their own condition with that of their slaves, and that this comparison has a double influence, because it is natural, and presented by the subject. When the fancy, in the comparison of objects, passes not easily from the one object to the other, the action of the mind is, in a great measure, broke, and the fancy, in considering the second object, begins, as it were, upon a new footing. The impression which attends every object seems not greater in that case by succeeding the less of the same kind. But these two impressions are distinct, and produce their distinct effects, without any communication together. The want of relation in the ideas breaks the relation of the impressions, and by such a separation, prevents their mutual operation and influence. To confirm this, we may observe that the proximity in the degree of merit is not alone sufficient to give rise to envy, but must be assisted by other relations. A poet is not apt to envy a philosopher, or a poet of a different kind, of a different nation, or of a different age. All these differences prevent or weaken the comparison, and consequently the passion. This too is the reason why all objects appear great or little, merely by a comparison with those of the same species. A mountain neither magnifies nor diminishes a horse in our eyes, but when a Flemish and a Welsh horse are seen together, the one appears greater and the other less than when viewed apart. From the same principle we may account for that remark of historians, that any party in a civil war always choose to call in a foreign enemy at any hazard rather than submit to their fellow citizens. Guichardin applies this remark to the wars in Italy, where the relations betwixt the different states are, properly speaking, nothing but of name, language, and contiguity. Yet even these relations, when joined with superiority, by making the comparison more natural, make it likewise more grievous, and cause men to search for some other superiority, which may be attended with no relation, and by that means may have a less sensible influence on the imagination. The mind quickly perceives its several advantages and disadvantages, and finding its situation to be most uneasy, where superiority is conjoined with other relations, seeks its repose as much as possible by their separation, and by breaking that association of ideas, which renders the comparison so much more natural and efficacious. When it cannot break the association, it feels a stronger desire to remove the superiority, and this is the reason why travelers are commonly so lavish of their praises to the Chinese and Persians, at the same time that they depreciate those neighboring nations, which may stand upon a foot of rivalship with their native country. These examples from history and common experience are rich and curious, but we may find parallel ones in the arts, which are no less remarkable. Should an author compose a treatise, of which one part was serious and profound, another light and humorous, every one would condemn so strange a mixture, and would accuse him of the neglect of all rules of art and criticism. These rules of art are founded on the qualities of human nature and the quality of human nature, which requires a consistency in every performance, is that which renders the mind incapable of passing in a moment from one passion and disposition to a quite different one. Yet this makes us not blame Mr. Prior for joining his Alma and his Solomon in the same volume, though that admirable poet has succeeded perfectly well in the gaiety of the one, as well as in the melancholy of the other. Even supposing the reader should peruse these two compositions without any interval, he would feel little or no difficulty in the change of passions. Why? But because he considers these performances as entirely different, and by this break in the ideas, breaks the progress of the affections, and hinders the one from influencing or contradicting the other. An heroic and burlesque design, united in one picture, would be monstrous though we place two pictures of so opposite a character in the same chamber, and even close by each other, without any scruple or difficulty. In a word, no ideas can affect each other, either by comparison, or by the passions they separately produce, unless they be united together by some relation, which may cause an easy transition of the ideas, and consequently of the emotions or impressions attending the ideas, and may preserve the one impression in the passage of the imagination to the object of the other. This principle is very remarkable, because it is analogous to what we have observed both concerning the understanding and the passions. Suppose two objects to be presented to me, which are not connected by any kind of relation. Suppose that each of these objects separately produces a passion, and that these two passions are in themselves contrary. We find from experience that the want of relation in the objects or ideas hinders the natural contrariety of the passions, and that the break in the transition of the thought removes the affections from each other, and prevents their opposition. It is the same case with comparison, and from both these phenomena we may safely conclude that the relation of ideas must forward the transition of impressions, since its absence alone is able to prevent it, and to separate what naturally should have operated upon each other. When the absence of an object or quality removes any usual or natural effect, we may certainly conclude that its presence contributes to the production of the effect. Sect. X of the mixture of benevolence and anger with compassion and malice. Thus we have endeavored to account for pity and malice. Both these affections arise from the imagination, according to the light in which it places its object. When our fancy considers directly the sentiments of others, and enters deep into them, it makes us sensible of all the passions it surveys, but in a particular manner of grief or sorrow. On the contrary, when we compare the sentiments of others to our own, we feel a sensation directly opposite to the original one, viz., a joy from the grief of others, and a grief from their joy. But these are only the first foundations of the affections of pity and malice. Other passions are afterwards confounded with them. There is always a mixture of love or tenderness with pity, and of hatred or anger with malice. But it must be confessed that this mixture seems at first sight to be contradictory to my system. For as pity is an uneasiness, and malice a joy, arising from the misery of others, pity should naturally, as in all other cases, produce hatred and malice. This contradiction I endeavor to reconcile after the following manner. In order to cause a transition of passions, there is required a double relation of impressions and ideas. Nor is one relation sufficient to produce this effect, but that we may understand the full force of this double relation, we must consider that it is not the present sensation alone or momentary pain or pleasure which determines the character of any passion, but the whole bent or tendency of it from the beginning to the end. One impression may be related to another, not only when their sensations are resembling, as we have all along supposed in the preceding cases, but also when their impulses or directions are similar and correspondent. This cannot take place with regard to pride and humility, because these are only pure sensations, without any direction or tendency to action. We are, therefore, to look for instances of this peculiar relation of impressions only in such affections as are attended with a certain appetite or desire, such as those of love and hatred. Benevolence, or the appetite which attends love, is a desire of the happiness of the person beloved, and an aversion to his misery is anger. Or the appetite which attends hatred is a desire of the misery of the person hated, and an aversion to his happiness. A desire, therefore, of the happiness of another, and aversion to his misery, are similar to benevolence, and a desire of his misery and aversion to his happiness are correspondent to anger. Now pity is a desire of happiness to another, and aversion to his misery is malice, is the contrary appetite. Pity, then, is related to benevolence and malice to anger. And as benevolence has been already found to be connected with love by a natural and original quality, and anger with hatred, it is by this chain the passions of pity and malice are connected with love and hatred. This hypothesis is founded on sufficient experience. A man who from any motives has entertained a resolution of performing an action, naturally runs into every other view or motive which may fortify that resolution, and give it authority and influence on the mind, to confirm us in any design. We search for motives drawn from interest, from honor, from duty. What wonder, then, that pity and benevolence, malice and anger, being the same desires arising from different principles, should so totally mix together as to be undistinguishable as to the connection betwixt benevolence and love, anger and hatred, being original and primary. It admits of no difficulty. We may add to this another experiment, viz., that benevolence and anger, and consequently love and hatred, arise when our happiness or misery have any dependence on the happiness or misery of another person, without any farther relation. I doubt not but this experiment will appear so singular as to excuse us for stopping a moment to consider it. Suppose that two persons of the same trade should seek employment in a town that is not able to maintain both. It is plain the success of one is perfectly incompatible with that of the other, and that whatever is for the interest of either is contrary to that of his rival. And so vice versa. Suppose again that two merchants, though living in different parts of the world, should enter into co-partnership together. The advantage or loss of one becomes immediately the advantage or loss of his partner, and the same fortune necessarily attends both. Now it is evident that in the first case, hatred always follows upon the contrariety of interests, as in the second. Love arises from their union. Let us consider to what principle we can ascribe these passions. It is plain they arise not from the double relations of impressions and ideas. If we regard only the present sensation, for taking the first case of rivalship, though the pleasure and advantage of an antagonist necessarily causes my pain and loss, yet to counterbalance this, his pain and loss causes my pleasure and advantage, and supposing him to be unsuccessful, I may by this means receive from him a superior degree of satisfaction. In the same manner the success of a partner rejoices me, but then his misfortunes afflict me in an equal proportion, and it is easy to imagine that the latter sentiment may in many cases preponderate. But whether the fortune of a rival or partner be good or bad, I always hate the former and love the latter. This love of a partner cannot proceed from the relation or connection betwixt us in the same manner as I love a brother or countryman. A rival has almost as close a relation to me as a partner. For as the pleasure of the latter causes my pleasure, and his pain my pain, so the pleasure of the former causes my pain, and his pain my pleasure. The connection, then, of cause and effect is the same in both cases, and if in the one case, the cause and effect have a farther relation of resemblance, they have that of contrariety in the other, which, being also a species of resemblance, leaves the matter pretty equal. The only explication, then, we can give of this phenomenon is derived from that principle of a parallel direction above mentioned. Our concern for our own interest gives us a pleasure in the pleasure, and a pain in the pain of a partner, after the same manner as by sympathy we feel a sensation correspondent to those which appear in any person who is present with us. On the other hand, the same concern for our interest makes us feel a pain in the pleasure, and a pleasure in the pain of a rival, and in short the same contrariety of sentiments as arises from comparison and malice. Since, therefore, a parallel direction of the affections, proceeding from interest, can give rise to benevolence or anger, no wonder the same parallel direction, derived from sympathy and from comparison, should have the same effect. In general we may observe that it is impossible to do good to others, from whatever motive, without feeling some touches of kindness and goodwill towards them, as the injuries we do not only cause hatred in the person who suffers them, but even in ourselves. These phenomena, indeed, may in part be accounted for from other principles. But here there occurs a considerable objection, which it will be necessary to examine before we proceed any farther. I have endeavored to prove that power and riches, or poverty and meanness, which give rise to love or hatred, without producing any original pleasure or uneasiness, operate upon us by means of a secondary sensation derived from a sympathy with that pain or satisfaction which they produce in the person who possesses them. From a sympathy with his pleasure there arises love, from that with his uneasiness, hatred. But it is a maxim which I have just now established, and which is absolutely necessary to the explication of the phenomena of pity and malice, that it is not a present sensation or momentary pain or pleasure which determines the character of any passion, but the general bent or tendency of it from the beginning to the end. For this reason, pity or a sympathy with pain produces love, and that because it interests us in the fortunes of others, good or bad, and gives us a secondary sensation correspondent to the primary, in which it has the same influence with love and benevolence. Since then this rule holds good in one case, why does it not prevail throughout? And why does sympathy in uneasiness ever produce any passion beside goodwill and kindness? Is it becoming a philosopher to alter his method of reasoning and run from one principle to its contrary, according to the particular phenomenon which he would explain? I have mentioned two different causes from which a transition of passion may arise, viz., a double relation of ideas and impressions, and, what is similar to it, a conformity in the tendency and direction of any two desires, which arise from different principles. Now I assert that, when a sympathy with uneasiness is weak, it produces hatred or contempt. By the former cause, when strong, it produces love or tenderness by the latter. This is the solution of the foregoing difficulty, which seems so urgent, and this is a principle founded on such evident arguments, that we ought to have established it, even though it were not necessary to the explication of any phenomenon. It is certain that sympathy is not always limited to the present moment, but that we often feel by communication the pains and pleasures of others, which are not in being, and which we only anticipate by the force of imagination. For supposing I saw a person perfectly unknown to me, who, while asleep in the fields, was in danger of being trod under foot by horses, I should immediately run to his assistance, and in this, I should be actuated by the same principle of sympathy, which makes me concerned for the present sorrows of a stranger. The bare mention of this is sufficient, sympathy being nothing but a lively idea converted into an impression. It is evident that, in considering the future, possible or probable condition of any person, we may enter into it with so vivid a conception as to make it our own concern, and by that means be sensible of pains and pleasures, which neither belong to ourselves, nor at the present instant have any real existence. But however we may look forward to the future in sympathizing with any person, the extending of our sympathy depends in a great measure upon our sense of his present condition. It is a great effort of imagination to form such lively ideas even of the present sentiments of others as to feel these very sentiments, but it is impossible we could extend this sympathy to the future, without being aided by some circumstance in the present, which strikes upon us in a lively manner. When the present misery of another has any strong influence upon me, the vivacity of the conception is not confined merely to its immediate object, but diffuses its influence over all the related ideas, and gives me a lively notion of all the circumstances of that person, whether past, present, or future, possible, probable or certain. By means of this lively notion, I am interested in them, take part with them, and feel a sympathetic motion in my breast, conformable to whatever I imagine in his. If I diminish the vivacity of the first conception, I diminish that of K. Related ideas, as pipes can convey no more water than what arises at the fountain. By this diminution I destroy the future prospect, which is necessary to interest me perfectly in the fortune of another. I may feel the present impression, but carry my sympathy no farther, and never transfuse the force of the first conception into my ideas of the related objects. If it be another's misery, which is presented in this feeble manner, I receive it by communication, and am affected with all the passions related to it. But as I am not so much interested as to concern myself in his good fortune, as well as his bad, I never feel the extensive sympathy, nor the passions related to it. Now, in order to know what passions are related to these different kinds of sympathy, we must consider that benevolence is an original pleasure, arising from the pleasure of the person beloved, and a pain proceeding from his pain, from which correspondence of impressions there arises a subsequent desire of his pleasure, and aversion to his pain. In order, then, to make a passion run parallel with benevolence, it is requisite we should feel these double impressions, correspondent to those of a person whom we consider, nor is any one of them alone sufficient for that purpose. When we sympathize only with one impression, and that a painful one, this sympathy is related to anger and to hatred, upon account of the uneasiness it conveys to us. But as the extensive or limited sympathy depends upon the force of the first sympathy, it follows that the passion of love or hatred depends upon the same principle. A strong impression, when communicated, gives a double tendency of the passions, which is related to benevolence and love by a similarity of direction. However painful the first impression might have been, a weak impression that is painful is related to anger and hatred by the resemblance of sensations. Benevolence, therefore, arises from a great degree of misery, or any degree strongly sympathized with. Hatred, or contempt from a small degree, or one weakly sympathized with, which is the principle I intended to prove and explain. Nor have we only our reason to trust to for this principle, but also experience. A certain degree of poverty produces contempt, but a degree beyond causes compassion and goodwill. We may undervalue a peasant or servant, but when the misery of a beggar appears very great, or is painted in very lively colors, we sympathize with him in his afflictions and feel in our heart evident touches of pity and benevolence. The same object causes contrary passions according to its different degrees. The passions, therefore, must depend upon principles that operate in such certain degrees. According to my hypothesis, the increase of the sympathy has evidently the same effect as the increase of the misery. A barren or desolate country always seems ugly and disagreeable, and commonly inspires us with contempt for the inhabitants. This deformity, however, proceeds in a great measure from a sympathy with the inhabitants, as has been already observed, but it is only a weak one, and reaches no farther than the immediate sensation, which is disagreeable. The view of a city in ashes conveys benevolent sentiments, because we there enter so deep into the interests of the miserable inhabitants, as to wish for their prosperity, as well as feel their adversity. But though the force of the impression generally produces pity and benevolence, it is certain that by being carried too far it ceases to have that effect. This, perhaps, may be worth our notice. When uneasiness is either small in itself, or remote from us, it engages not the imagination, nor is able to convey an equal concern for the future and contingent good, as for the present and real evil upon its acquiring greater force. We become so interested in the concerns of the person, as to be sensible both of his good and had fortune, and from that complete sympathy there arises pity and benevolence. But it will easily be imagined that where the present evil strikes with more than ordinary force, it may entirely engage our attention, and prevent that double sympathy above mentioned. Thus we find that though everyone, but especially women, are apt to contract a kindness for criminals who go to the scaffold, and readily imagine them to be uncommonly handsome and well-shaped, yet one who is present at the cruel execution of the rack feels no such tender emotions, but is in a manner overcome with horror, and has no leisure to temper this uneasy sensation by any opposite sympathy. But the instance which makes the most clearly for my hypothesis is that wherein by a change of the objects we separate the double sympathy, even from a middling degree of the passion, in which case we find that pity, instead of producing love and tenderness as usual, always gives rise to the contrary affection. When we observe a person in misfortunes, we are affected with pity and love, but the author of that misfortune becomes the object of our strongest hatred, and is the more detested in proportion to the degree of our compassion. Now for what reason should the same passion of pity produce love to the person who suffers the misfortune, and hatred to the person who causes it, unless it be because in the latter case the author bears a relation only to the misfortune, whereas in considering the sufferer we carry our view on every side, and wish for his prosperity, as well as are sensible of his affliction. I shall just observe, before I leave the present subject, that this phenomenon of the double sympathy, and its tendency to cause love, may contribute to the production of the kindness which we naturally bear. Our relations and acquaintance, custom and relation make us enter deeply into the sentiments of others, and whatever fortune we suppose to attend them is rendered present to us by the imagination, and operates as if originally our own. We rejoice in their pleasures, and grieve for their sorrows, merely from the force of sympathy. Nothing that concerns them is indifferent to us, and as this correspondence of sentiments is the natural attendant of love, it readily produces that affection. Sect X of respect and contempt. There now remains only to explain the passion of respect and contempt, along with the amorous affection. In order to understand all the passions which have any mixture of love or hatred, let us begin with respect and contempt. In considering the qualities and circumstances of others, we may either regard them as they really are in themselves, or may make a comparison betwixt them and our own qualities and circumstances, or may join these two methods of consideration, the good qualities of others from the first point of view, produce love from the second, humility, and from the third, respect, which is a mixture of these two passions. Their bad qualities, after the same manner, cause either hatred, or pride, or contempt, according to the light in which we survey them. That there is a mixture of pride in contempt, and of humility in respect, is, I think, too evident, from their very feeling or appearance, to require any particular proof. That this mixture arises from a tacit comparison of the person contemned or respected with ourselves is no less evident. the same man may cause either respect, love, or contempt by his condition and talents, according as the person who considers him from his inferior becomes his equal or superior. In changing the point of view, though the object may remain the same, its proportion to ourselves entirely alters, which is the cause of an alteration in the passions. These passions, therefore, arise from our observing the proportion, that is, from a comparison. I have already observed that the mind has a much stronger propensity to pride than to humility, and have endeavored, from the principles of human nature, to assign a cause for this phenomenon. Whether my reasoning be received or not, the phenomenon is undisputed, and appears, in many instances, among the rest. It is the reason why there is a much greater mixture of pride in contempt than of humility in respect, and why we are more elevated with the view of one below us than mortified with the presence of one above us. Contempt or scorn has so strong a tincture of pride that there scarce is any other passion discernible, whereas in esteem or respect, love makes a more considerable ingredient than humility. The passion of vanity is so prompt that it ruses at the least call, while humility requires a stronger impulse to make it exert itself. But here it may reasonably be asked, why this mixture takes place only in some cases, and appears not on every occasion. All those objects which cause love, when placed on another person, are the causes of pride, when transferred to ourselves, and consequently ought to be causes of humility, as well as love, while they belong to others, and are only compared to those which we ourselves possess. In like manner every quality which, by being directly considered, produces hatred, ought always to give rise to pride by comparison, and by a mixture of these passions of hatred and pride ought to excite contempt or scorn. The difficulty then is, why any objects ever cause pure love or hatred, and produce not always the mixed passions of respect and contempt. I have supposed all along that the passions of love and pride, and those of humility and hatred, are similar in their sensations, and that the two former are always agreeable, and the two latter painful. But though this be universally true, it is observable that the two agreeable, as well as the two painful passions, have some difference, and even contrarieties, which distinguish them. Nothing invigorates and exalts the mind equally with pride and vanity, though at the same time love or tenderness is rather found to weaken and enfeeble it. The same difference is observable betwixt the uneasy passions, anger and hatred, bestow a new force on all our thoughts and actions, while humility and shame deject and discourage us. Of these qualities of the passions, it will be necessary to form a distinct idea. Let us remember that pride and hatred invigorate the soul, and love and humility enfeeble it. From this it follows that though the conformity betwixt love and hatred, in the agreeableness of their sensation, makes them always be excited by the same objects, yet this other contrariety is the reason why they are excited in very different degrees. Genius and learning are pleasant and magnificent objects, and by both these circumstances are adapted to pride and vanity, but have a relation to love by their pleasure only. Ignorance and simplicity are disagreeable and mean, which in the same manner gives them a double connection with humility, and a single one with hatred. We may, therefore, consider it as certain that though the same object always produces love and pride, humility and hatred, according to its different situations, yet it seldom produces either the two former or the two latter passions, in the same proportion. It is here we must seek for a solution of the difficulty above mentioned. Why any object ever excites pure love or hatred, and does not always produce respect or contempt, by a mixture of humility or pride. No quality in another gives rise to humility by comparison, unless it would have produced pride by being placed in ourselves in. Vice versa, no object excites pride by comparison, unless it would have produced humility by the direct survey. This is evident. Objects always produce by comparison a sensation directly contrary to their original. 1. Suppose, therefore, an object to be presented, which is peculiarly fitted to produce love, but imperfectly to excite pride. This object, belonging to another, gives rise directly to a great degree of love, but to a small one of humility by comparison, and consequently that latter passion is scarce felt in the compound, nor is able to convert the love into respect. This is the case with good nature, good humor, facility, generosity, beauty, and many other qualities. These have a peculiar aptitude to produce love in others, but not so great a tendency to excite pride in ourselves, for which reason the view of them as belonging to another person produces pure love, with but a small mixture of humility and respect. It is easy to extend the same reasoning to the opposite passions. Before we leave this subject, it may not be amiss to account for a pretty curious phenomenon, viz., why we commonly keep at a distance such as we contemn, and allow not our inferiors to approach too near even in place and situation. It has already been observed that almost every kind of idea is attended with some emotion, even the ideas of number and extension, much more those of such objects as are esteemed of consequence in life, and fix our attention. It is not with entire indifference we can survey either a rich man or a poor one, but must feel some faint touches at least of respect in the former case, and of contempt in the latter. These two passions are contrary to each other, but in order to make this contrariety be felt, the objects must be some way related, otherwise the affections are totally separate and distinct, and never encounter. The relation takes place wherever they persons become contiguous, which is a general reason why we are uneasy at seeing such disproportioned objects as a rich man and a poor one, a nobleman and a pauper. In that situation, this uneasiness, which is common to every spectator, must be more sensible to the superior, and that because the near approach of the inferior is regarded as a piece of ill breeding, and shows that he is not sensible of the disproportion, and is no way affected by it. A sense of superiority in another breeds in all men an inclination to keep themselves at a distance from him, and determines them to redouble the marks of respect and reverence when they are obliged to approach him, and where they do not observe that conduct, it is a proof they are not sensible of his superiority. From hence too it proceeds that any great difference in the degrees of any quality is called a distance by a common metaphor, which, however trivial it may appear, is founded on natural principles of the imagination. A great difference inclines us to produce a distance. The ideas of distance and difference are, therefore, connected together. Connected ideas are readily taken for each other, and this is in general the source of the metaphor, as we shall have occasion to observe afterwards. Sect 11 of the amorous passion. O our love betwixt the sexes, of all the compound passions, which proceed from a mixture of love and hatred with other affections, no one better deserves our attention than that love, which arises betwixt the sexes, as well on account of its force and violence, as those curious principles of philosophy, for which it affords us an uncontestable argument. It is plain that this affection, in its most natural state, is derived from the conjunction of three different impressions or passions, viz., the pleasing sensation arising from beauty, the bodily appetite for generation, and a generous kindness or goodwill. The origin of kindness from beauty may be explained from the foregoing reasoning. The question is how the bodily appetite is excited by it. The appetite of generation, when confined to a certain degree, is evidently of the pleasant kind, and has a strong connection with all the agreeable emotions. Joy, mirth, vanity, and kindness are all incentives to this desire, as well as music, dancing, wine, and good cheer. On the other hand, sorrow, melancholy, poverty, humility are destructive of it. From this quality it is easily conceived why it should be connected with the sense of beauty. But there is another principle that contributes to the same effect. I have observed that the parallel direction of the desires is a real relation, and no less than a resemblance in their sensation, produces a connection among them. That we may fully comprehend the extent of this relation, we must consider that any principal desire may be attended with subordinate ones, which are connected with it, and to which, if other desires are parallel, they are by that means related to the principal one. Thus hunger may oft be considered as the primary inclination of the soul, and the desire of approaching the meat as the secondary one, since it is absolutely necessary to the satisfying that appetite. If an object, therefore, by any separate qualities, inclines us to approach the meat, it naturally increases our appetite, as on the contrary, whatever inclines us to set our victuals at a distance, is contradictory to hunger, and diminishes our inclination to them. Now, it is plain that beauty has the first effect, and deformity the second, which is the reason why the former gives us a keener appetite for our victuals, and the latter is sufficient to disgust us at the most savory dish that cookery has invented. All this is easily applicable to the appetite for generation. From these two relations, viz., resemblance and a parallel desire, there arises such a connection betwixt the sense of beauty, the bodily appetite, and benevolence, that they become in a manner inseparable. And we find from experience that it is indifferent which of them advances first, since any of them is almost sure to be attended with the related affections. One who is inflamed with lust feels at least a momentary kindness towards the object of it, and at the same time fancies her more beautiful than ordinary, as there are many who begin with kindness and esteem for the wit and merit of the person, and advance from that to the other passions. But the most common species of love is that which first arises from beauty, and after ards diffuses itself into kindness and into the bodily appetite. Kindness or esteem, and the appetite to generation, are too remote to unite easily together. The one is, perhaps, the most refined passion of the soul, the other the most gross and vulgar. The love of beauty is placed in a just medium betwixt them, and partakes of both their natures, from whence it proceeds, that it is so singularly fitted to produce both. This account of love is not peculiar to my system, but is unavoidable. On any hypothesis, the three affections, which compose this passion, are evidently distinct, and has each of them its distinct object. It is certain, therefore, that it is only by their relation they produce each other. But the relation of passions is not alone sufficient. It is likewise necessary there should be a relation of ideas. The beauty of one person never inspires us with love for another. This then is a sensible proof of the double relation of impressions and ideas. From one instance so evident as this we may form a judgment of the rest. This may also serve in another view to illustrate what I have insisted on concerning the origin of pride and humility, love and hatred. I have observed that though self be the object of the first set of passions, and some other person of the second, yet these objects cannot alone be the causes of the passions, as having each of them a relation to two contrary affections, which must from the very first moment destroy each other. Here then is the situation of the mind. As I have already described it, it has certain organs naturally fitted to produce a passion. That passion, when produced, naturally turns the view to a certain object. But this not being sufficient to produce the passion, there is required some other emotion, which by a double relation of impressions and ideas may set these principles in action, and bestow on them their first impulse. This situation is still more remarkable with regard to the appetite of generation. Sex is not only the object, but also the cause of the appetite. We not only turn our view to it when actuated by that appetite, but the reflecting on it suffices to excite the appetite. But as this cause loses its force by too great frequency, it is necessary it should be quickened by some new impulse, and that impulse we find to arise from the beauty of the person, that is, from a double relation of impressions and ideas. Since this double relation is necessary where an affection has both a distinct cause and object, how much more so where it has only a distinct object, without any determinate cause. Sect 12 of the love and hatred of animals. But to pass from the passions of love and hatred, and from their mixtures and compositions, as they appear in man, to the same affections, as they display themselves in brutes, we may observe, not only that love and hatred are common to the whole sensitive creation, but likewise that their causes, as above explained, are of so simple a nature, that they may easily be supposed to operate on mere animals. There is no force of reflection or penetration required. Everything is conducted by springs and principles, which are not peculiar to man, or any one species of animals. The conclusion from this is obvious in favor of the foregoing system. Love in animals has not for its only object animals of the same species, but extends itself farther, and comprehends almost every sensible and thinking being. A dog naturally loves a man above his own species, and very commonly meets with a return of affection. As animals are but little susceptible either of the pleasures or pains of the imagination, they can judge of objects only by the sensible, good or evil, which they produce, and from that must regulate their affections towards them. Accordingly we find that by benefits or injuries we produce their love or hatred, and that by feeding and cherishing any animal, we quickly acquire his affections, as by beating and abusing him we never fail to draw on us his enmity and ill will. Love in beasts is not caused so much by relation as in our species, and that because their thoughts are not so active as to trace relations, except in very obvious instances. Yet it is easy to remark that on some occasions it has a considerable influence upon them. Thus acquaintance, which has the same effect as relation, always produces love in animals. either to men or to each other. For the same reason, any likeness among them is the source of affection. An ox confined to a park with horses will naturally join their company, if I may so speak, but always leaves it to enjoy that of his own species, where he has the choice of both. The affection of parents to their young proceeds from a peculiar instinct in animals, as well as in our species. It is evident that sympathy, or the communication of passions, takes place among animals, no less than among men. Fear, anger, courage, and other affections are frequently communicated from one animal to another, without their knowledge of that cause which produced the original passion. Grief likewise is received by sympathy and produces almost all the same consequences, and excites the same emotions as in our species. The howlings and lamentations of a dog produce a sensible concern in his fellows, and it is remarkable that though almost all animals use in play the same member, and nearly the same action as in fighting a lion, a tiger, a cat their paws, an ox his horns, a dog his teeth, a horse his heels, yet they most carefully avoid harming their companion, even though they have nothing to fear from his resentment, which is an evident proof of the sense brutes have of each other's pain and pleasure. Everyone has observed how much more dogs are animated when they hunt in a pack than when they pursue their game apart, and it is evident this can proceed from nothing but from sympathy. It is also well known to hunters that this effect follows in a greater degree, and even in too great a degree, where two packs that are strangers to each other are joined together. We might, perhaps, be at a loss to explain this phenomenon if we had not experience of a similar in ourselves. Envy and malice are passions very remarkable in animals. They are perhaps more common than pity is, requiring less effort of thought and imagination.